session we have now is Europe on the Brink, reporting Brexit, and we have four excellent panelists. I'm Simon Hicks. I'm Professor of Political Science in the Government Department here at the LSE. I'm also a Senior Fellow on the Economic and Social Research Council project on UK and a Changing Europe, which means that as fellows we have to get involved in the public debate. So as an academic, I'm starting to get used to getting involved in the public debate about Brexit, and I have to pretend to be as neutral as I can, which is quite difficult for someone if you know my research and my background. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a journalist. I'm not even someone who studies journalism. But I have views about these issues, and we have a great panelist here. On my right here we have Iain Martin. Iain, commentator and author, editor of CapX, pro-market site launched in 2015, former editor of The Scotsman, also worked for the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph and the Wall Street Journal. His next book, Crash Bang Wallop, the inside story of Big Bang and the financial revolution that changed the world, will be published by Spectre in September 2016. He lives in London, had a lot of experience of the Scottish referendum. He's sick of referendums, he tells me. Katrin, to my left here. How do you say your name, Katrin? Pribyl. Katrin Pribyl works as a UK and Ireland correspondent for German and Austrian newspapers through the Europa-Büro Detlef, an agency with offices in London, Brussels and Paris. She mainly covers political and constitutional issues and has reported on the Scottish referendum, the 2015 general election and the upcoming EU referendum. Then we have Vincent Collen. Vincent is the UK correspondent for Les Echos, the French business daily newspaper. Been covering UK news since September 2014. Prior to this, he was based in Paris, where he covered high-tech and telecom sector, pharmaceuticals and chemical industry, and French social affairs. He studied at Sciences Po and at the Centre de Formation des Journalistes in Paris. Then we have, last but not least, Anne Applebaum, columnist for the Washington Post and Slate. She directs the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute in London and is an adjunct fellow of the Centre for European Policy Analysis. So a lot of experience here. I'm going to lead from questions in a sort of question-style format. We have just about 55 minutes. We'll leave 15-20 minutes for questions from the audience. But first of all, Iain, does this feel different to the Scottish referendum in terms of how the media are covering it, and, you know, from your perspective?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it gets, as you indicated, I've probably, having spent a lot of time covering the Scottish referendum, I've really had just about enough of referendums to last me a lifetime, really. I think that on the positive side, the indications are that it's not dividing people in quite the same way. And what I mean by that is that families are divided in Scotland. I mean, my own family was divided by the question. And that's quite a common experience, and things got incredibly nasty. A lot of abuse towards journalists, and on Facebook and Twitter the atmosphere became toxic, and it has polluted the political process. A nationalist would say the opposite, would say that it has liberated people and had an extraordinary impact. But from my perspective as a unionist, and I think lots of people would agree, it was a very poisonous experience. So I think one other lesson, though, that people should bear in mind from Scotland is that it will get this EU referendum campaign will take people by surprise in the final 3 or 4 weeks. It will get very, very heated very quickly, and it will dominate absolutely everything, and everything will be seen through the prism of the referendum. So those final 2 or 3 weeks, from the perspective of a political journalist, are going to be enormously entertaining. How enlightening they're going to be for the readers and for the voters is a different question.
But I realise the public debate was very divided, and perhaps more so than the debate about Brexit right now. But the media debate in Scotland, was that as divided as the media debate here is now? I think you've seen some lines drawn very clearly between newspapers and editors and opinion pieces on one side in the Express and the Mail and the Telegraph, for example, against, say, the Guardian or the Financial Times or the Independent on the other, with the Times wavering in the middle.
Well, what it illustrated, the Scottish referendum campaign, other than one key exception, which was when the Daily Record, on the back of a fag packet, put together a thing called The Vow, which the nationalists say influenced the vote in favour of the Union. Actually, it was an example of the weakening power of the mainstream media.
Right.
It was, there were very few columnists or journalists or publications that were in favour of Scottish independence, but the nationalists still ran a brilliant campaign which played very often outside the mainstream media, and a lot of nationalists you would speak to didn't trust the mainstream media and would go to Facebook for their news, which is kind of scary in a sense. You think that it's an echo chamber where people hear views that they agree with repeated back to them. But it was not. I think that will also be a factor in the UK referendum. I don't think the British press is anything like as powerful as it was when I got into the industry 20 odd years ago. If you look at the 1992 election, you could say with some conviction it's the Sun what won it. I mean, that's Kelvin Mackenzie, bit of melodrama, but the media was incredibly powerful in that election. I think now, I think how the press falls on this will influence people a lot less than would have been the case.
So Anne, I wanted to come to you next on, do you feel, I know you're involved in this group InFacts, do you feel that the public via the media are getting accurate information on either side of the campaign? If not, why not?
Thanks for that question. So yes, I'm involved as a kind of honorary editor of a thing called infacts.org, which was set up a few months ago to fact check the campaign. And one of the interesting things about watching how that process has progressed is how little difference fact-checking seems to make. Iain, it's interesting you say that you don't think there are divisions. I think maybe there aren't divisions yet. I'm beginning to feel among my friends, kind of, because I know people on both sides, a lot of division, a lot of emotion. I think emotion is beginning to cloud the debate already to the extent that when facts are checked, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's one particularly famous one, and it's been used by Michael Gove. I think it was used yesterday by Dominic Cummings, which is that if we leave the EU, we can take back the £350 million that we give to the EU every week. This number has been shown kind of over and over again to be incorrect. It doesn't take into account budget rebates. It doesn't. It's a completely fictitious number, but it doesn't matter. It keeps getting used. Another one is the 80 occurrences or the 80 times in which we were voted in the European Council, but we didn't get our way. The real number is that since 1999. Britain has voted, the resolution for which Britain has supported in the European Council has won 2,474 times, and Britain has lost 57 times. So the record is actually quite different. Nevertheless, again, this number, we don't get our way, repeated over and over again. A third one that's quite emotive is this thing about the border. As EU members, we have to accept that anyone, even someone with a criminal record, can breeze into Britain. That's actually not true. The UK can refuse entry on the grounds of public security to anybody. There are border checks. Britain is not in Schengen, and so on and so on and so on. And you can find these examples of facts that are being recirculated, despite the fact that they're repeatedly proved wrong. So the question is why. I think one of the reasons may be to do with the emotions that underlie this. A lot of this is a debate about, for some people, this is a debate about freedom, or national identity, or things that seem to them to be more important than facts, and therefore the facts get ignored. Another problem might be to do with, and you see this in other kinds of debates now, that the nature of modern media is such that there's so much of it, and it multiplies all over the place, that the question of what's true and what's not, as it becomes harder and harder to establish, people just stop caring altogether. I would add that a third thing, which is the nature of social media, which, as we know, I'm sure you've already had this conversation. If anybody talks about the media nowadays, this is one of the first things that is ever discussed. The nature of social media is such that it creates kind of fact-free ghettos. You can now live inside a social media world in which the people you follow on Facebook and Twitter and the magazines and websites that you look for information all agree about one set of facts. And to find the contrary set of facts is impossible or difficult. And within those worlds, you can exist on, in sort of completely fictional fantasy spaces, and many people do, including apparently politicians and people in the media. So it becomes very difficult to separate what's true from what's not true. And you see that very, very clearly in this debate, in a way that I haven't seen it in Britain this clearly before. Usually in Britain, I'd say there's a fourth factor, which is that, there's the really admirable thing about the BBC, and the thing that's admired around the world and imitated, and everybody wants their own state media to be like it, is the fact that it tries to be objective and fair and show both sides of the argument at all times. But that often means that BBC presenters, and I saw this during the debate about the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, BBC presenters feel obligated to say, well, here's one argument and here's the other argument. And this person says we can take back the £350 million that we give the EU every week, and this person says, actually, it's not £350 million. And the BBC presenter, or whoever it is on the other channels, because this is, of course, a British tradition, is obliged to stand in the middle and say, here are the two arguments, take your pick. And they don't make judgments, or they don't intervene and say, well, actually, that number's false, or it's based on a wrong assumption. And I think that it's kind of, I see that now in almost everywhere in the debate, that it's becoming hard to separate what's true and not true because of simply the nature of what's taken to be fair media in Britain.
Great. Well, I think that leads very much onto these two here. So, Katrin, how does coming from Germany to the British debate, does what Anne say echo to you in terms of, does it feel very different to German media coverage of Europe? I mean, what are your sort of thoughts coming from a German perspective to the UK and being thrown into the midst of this maelstrom here?
I mean, thank you very much, Simon. I'm very happy to be here. I think it's a very emotional debate, and I would totally agree to Anne that very often I'm missing facts, actually. It's without any context, like political actors say something, and then there's the other side. But I would really, very often, I would hope for some sort of context, actually, where this whole thing is thrown in. And I think it's very difficult for actually British people to get informed, to pick the right things. When I'm traveling to the country for getting an idea of what British people actually think about the EU or the referendum, a lot of people are just confused. They're very badly informed. They don't know anything. Then they might have picked up a line from Boris Johnson or from David Cameron, whatever side. And then very often the figures are not true. They don't even know anymore who to trust. So they're very confused. They don't see the importance of this referendum either, I would say. A lot of them kind of think it's a conservative battle, basically. It's very personality driven in the media, which I think is a mistake, because it's not about Boris Johnson against David Cameron or Michael Gove against George Osborne. But that's how it's kind of presented. And I think that's quite risky for Britain.
So you don't buy one of the arguments in favour of a referendum of some of the pro-Europeans was that Britain was, since 1975, Britain has not really had much media coverage of Europe. The British public is very badly informed about the EU. There's evidence, for example, from France or from Denmark or Ireland where there have been referendums. This then leads to a public that has been more informed, because there has to then be public debate about these issues. And then as a result of that public debate, the public learns about the EU, what it is, what it does, what we do in it. So you don't get the sense of that at all?
I think the biggest problem was that a lot of journalists actually didn't have a lot of knowledge about the European Union, if I'm honest, about the institutions, about what are the benefits. And it's very driven by the government elite, the political agenda, and not so much about, how is the EU actually influencing my daily life or the daily lives of the British people. And so it was this EU bashing for so many years, also from all the political elite, let's say. So it's very difficult now, I would say, also for the media to make it turn around. And I do think the last couple of months the coverage got better, because journalists had to kind of inform themselves. They had to, kind of learn more about Europe, the EU, but it's still not enough for me.
So, and what about do you really feel, I mean, are you surprised by the sort of sensational nature of some of the media coverage compared to German media coverage?
Compared to Germany, I mean, here it is, like British media is campaigning very openly, and we don't know this in that extent, not at all. And I mean, like only last year about this whole migration issue was, let's say, astonishing for me to see.
But you haven't seen a trend. I mean, is it what we've seen in Britain is you know, perhaps earlier in the UK than some other countries in Europe, we had a more competitive media market.
Yes.
And then declining media sales, the market gets even more competitive. The TV news, the BBC is now far more competitive and squeezed by Sky and ITV and Channel 4 and so on. We've got social media they're competing with, and is it the fact that we just have are we seeing similar trends, say in Germany or in France, I'll come to you in a second, Vincent, where in a highly fragmented, highly competitive media market, you know, you get more shrill voices, the pressure on the editors to try and really make news that people are really going to want to read and make sensationalize it. Are we seeing similar things in Germany, for example, with German media coverage of the refugees and the migration crisis in Germany? Isn't that also becoming much more sensationalist in a way as well?
It definitely is, especially through the online media. But I still think, I mean, it's a great thing about the British press that it is like quite outstanding, isn't it? But I just think like the EU is a very complex issue, and right now, I would even argue that partly there is a referendum only because of some Eurosceptic press, like putting a lot of pressure on the government. And I mean, for them, it's just amazing. It's selling papers to have this drama about Europe, this like kind of, you know, struggles, battles in Westminster. But I think it is, like in Germany, of course, it's more about sensational things as well, but like here it's more taking sides and campaigning for them, and I think that's the big difference. Vincent,
from France, how does it feel coming from France?
Well, yes, what strikes a French journalist in Britain is that I think that the UK press is much more powerful here in setting the agenda, especially on Europe, than it is in France. Iain was saying that this power has declined a lot in the past 20 years, but still, when you come from France, you're amazed by this agenda setting power that the UK media still have. It was very striking just after the European summit, where David Cameron was renegotiating. Most of the European press, at least the French press, but I suppose it was the same in Germany, thought that Cameron had a very good deal, that he had got a lot of from the other European partners. The UK press decided immediately the night after the summit on Saturday morning, whether right wing or left wing, that he didn't get much, and that anyway this was not the issue, and then it was completely set aside a few hours after the renegotiation. I thought that was really striking. It really showed that the media here had the power to set the agenda still. Although, despite what Iain was saying, in France it's nowhere as powerful. The French press is much has much less power than the UK press. The circulation is much lower. It's going down a lot in Britain, but it is going down a lot in France also, but from a much lower base. And then the other difference is that in France we don't have the Daily Mail or the Sun or the Mirror. It's or Bild, the German tabloid. We don't have powerful. Yeah, but it's very powerful.
But Bild is very powerful. Yeah.
But we don't have very powerful tabloids in France who set the agenda on issues like this. And then Europe is not a big issue. Europe is very much a topic for the elites, for the Le Monde and Le Figaro and Les Echos. We write about Europe all the time, and the French elite talk about the Brexit referendum a lot. But the mainstream, the electorate, for the electorate in France, it's not a mainstream
But
topic.
coming to Anne's point, I mean, you've had several referendums in France, the Maastricht referendum, the referendum on the constitutional treaty. Was there a sense that that this was a more fact-based debate, or was it equally emotional, and not just the print media, but also the radio or the TV news? It's more pluralistic in France, I think, than it is in the UK, where it tends to be dominated by the agenda tends to be set by the idiots on the Today programme in the morning. But
I wouldn't agree.
but. So was it more fact-based in France on those referendums?
Well, it was the 2005 referendum on the last referendum we have on Europe in France was a very interesting case if you compare it to what's happening in the UK today, because all the French press was for pro-yes for the referendum, whether right-wing or left-wing. All the main political parties, except the extreme parties, were for the yes vote, and of course the no won by I think 53% or something. So it was a major crisis for the political class, but also for the media, because the French media were accused of being completely out of touch.
So there wasn't
with
any
what's
pressure.
happened.
There wasn't any pressure on, let's say, the news editors of the TV news or the radio news to have two different sides in the debate, or whenever they discuss the issue.
Well, not enough apparently, and then there was a lot of pressure afterwards, after the result, on the media, telling them you didn't give both sides enough space. You were biased.
So, Iain, back to you, Iain. There was one thing I've always wondered in the UK debate, as someone not involved in the media but watching it from the outside as a social scientist. We often get claims that it's the press influences voters, the press influences the public, but when you talk to editors, they say, well, it's a competitive market. We have to give them what they want. We're not trying to influence them. We want to give them what they want. If we don't, they're going to buy another newspaper or tune into another TV station. I mean, how does it feel from being an editor of a newspaper?
This is why you'll see the splash in the front page picture in the Telegraph is that, and I think in every paper other than the Guardian, which has Victoria Wood, in every other paper, it's clear what the press's agenda is, selling newspapers, and why not? But I'm going to defend the British press just for a second. You go through those newspapers every day, as journalists tend to, and there is tons of coverage in here, and there has been for months, and I just don't buy the idea that it is all in one direction. I mean, if you go through the list, go through where the papers stand. So the Mail is almost certainly for out, but it's not definitively decided yet, but its coverage leans out. The Mail on Sunday is for in, probably. The Sunday Times, it's unclear, and has been publishing columns by Neil Ferguson and lots of commentary which is in favour of in. The Times took a decision, very sensible decision by the editor John Witherow, to just report it as straight as possible and to have the columnists battle it out. And it will then give its view to its readers in the final week. The Guardian is obviously very heavily for in and has almost no out commentary at all. Every time I meet a friend of mine from the Guardian, they're astonished. They're just, how can Leave be at 40% in the polls?
They had a piece by Dan Hannon the other day.
Okay, a first. Did you read the comments underneath it? But the FT is definitely for in. The Sun is, you'd be unsurprised to hear, probably for out, but that's not guaranteed. The decision is in the hands of the editor and Rupert Murdoch, and we'll know in a few weeks. The Express is for out, and the Mirror is for in. So I don't see how that equates to this monolithic, massive sort of press machine, all saying one thing and pushing lies about the European Union. One of the things which I think is interesting to ask, I mean, you're the chair, but if you'll permit me, I was just going to ask how many people here today read a newspaper every single day? That's about...
Come on, audience of journalists, yeah.
They're at a media conference. We call this selection bias.
Okay, but even so that's about two. So there are about a third of people at a conference. But you buy a newspaper every day.
You mean on paper?
On paper.
Oh, well then, no. On paper.
On paper.
You buy a newspaper.
So buy a newspaper on paper.
Not a free one, you actually buy it.
You buy a newspaper on paper, so that's how many?
5%.
Yeah. But how many people are reading the newspaper online, though, as a regular every day, right?
And how many people are reading that list that I read out, pretty much those newspapers 4 or 5 times a week?
What,
Lots.
all of them or just one of them?
Most of them, the Mail, the Times, the Sunday Times, the FT.
But may I say,
It's just, I think it is a myth, the idea that the press is monolithic. And a lot of the criticism that when people sort of chortle about the Mail, understand that criticism of the Mail, but is very often from people who, you ask those people, when did you last read a copy of the Daily Mail? And they don't read it.
Do you guys want to come back on any of this?
yeah, but then you go to the on the street and ask people, and how many FT readers would you find?
Speak into the microphone.
I do. Okay. I just think I haven't met. If you just ask people on the streets, how many FT readers do you find? It's a lot of people get their information from one paper and not from 10 different ones. And then you have a lot of Daily Mail readers, Mail on Sunday. Telegraph is my very much campaigning as well. The Sun. And I do think the FT or the Guardian or the Sunday Times, of course they are having more, more different sides, more facts and so on. But I don't think people are reading 5 papers a day. Maybe here.
And most consumers are getting it from a combination of broadcast, which is, as we've said, you can quibble about whether it should be on the one hand, on the other, and the relationship to fact-checking, but is broadly, from the BBC, a balanced picture of the referendum, and from ITN, and from Channel 4, and from Sky as well. So that's their main source of information. They're then maybe picking up a newspaper a couple of days a week and getting a bit of that, and then a bit of social media. So I think the idea that people are sitting there passing the Times leader and thinking, oh, well, that's a good point, but that's not answered by the Mail's point about the Common Agricultural Policy. It's just not how people consume media.
Yeah, but on the point where, the fact that this is such a competitive media market, I mean, do you must feel that from the inside of newspapers and from editors. I mean, the idea that they're free to be campaigning and say whatever they want and do whatever they want and try and kind of swing the public a particular way, which is the impression from the outside. I mean, is it, or is it more of a they've got to trade that off against the fact that they're worried about numbers?
It's a very good point. I mean, I think what shouldn't be underestimated is how shouty broadly newspapers have had to become in the last 15, 20 years to get attention. The ad market is being destroyed by the internet. Newspapers, big media organisations that don't have a subsidy like the BBC are being potentially eaten alive unless they have someone like Murdoch who believes in subsidising them because he likes newspapers and likes the power that comes from owning them. Generally, the pressure on advertising has been incredibly intense. Circulation is declining and reader habits are changing dramatically. So I'm not going to deny it. There is a pressure then on newspapers to shout louder, to become potentially, in some cases, hysterical.
Any of you guys want to respond to any of the points?
I mean, I think that's obviously a deeper problem with the entire press in pretty much every Western country, and in a way, Britain is, I work a lot across Europe, and I spend a lot of time in the eastern half of Europe, and one of the things that's really striking is how in a number of countries, mainstream media has disappeared completely. And the result of that, almost directly, is the emergence of very fractionalized politics, extremist parties, the rise of conspiracy theories and kind of conspiracy thinking, and that's happening in a lot of European countries. I just saw it in the Netherlands. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and one of the reasons, and I was trying to understand, well, there's a little bit of that here now, particularly on the left, but not only. One of the reasons why I think it doesn't happen here, and the only reason I can see that makes Britain different from the rest of Europe, is the BBC. precisely because the BBC, for all of its many flaws, and I know everybody hates it, and the right hates it, and the left hates it, and you hate the Today program, somebody else here hates Newsnight, and I find this one hand on the other hand thing just drives me to distraction. On the other hand, because you have the BBC and because it's so powerful, you have this kind of center in the market that keeps some idea that there ought to be some objectivity or some goal, some theoretical goal, that you have in the British media, which actually you don't have now in many countries. I think you still have it in Germany because the private media is so strong and you have these big, strong newspapers. But, the Netherlands, Poland, I mean, there are a lot of countries, if you look around Europe, which don't really have anymore anything that looks like anything as reliable as the BBC or the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, nothing like that.
So in France and Germany, I ask the two of you first, Vincent first. How does the average citizen in France get facts or information or balanced news about Europe? So here, the argument is, in the UK, you can either get it from the BBC or you can get it from balanced press taking different sides, and they weigh up against each other. And through some kind of osmosis, we end up with getting a lot of information, a lot of facts, and it gets balanced through that. So, that's a more positive spin on the media debate and coverage in the UK.
Well, I think, in France, I agree with what Iain was saying about the British public. Most people would get their information from a mix of maybe one radio they listen to in the morning and TV news they watch in the evening, and then maybe one newspaper and social media during the day. What is, I think, very different in France is that Europe doesn't get as much coverage as it does here. Of course, it's a bit different. It's a bit special these days because of the referendum. But I think even before this, you would never. It's not as mainstream a topic as it is in the UK. It doesn't sell paper to talk about Europe. All the institutional stuff is very boring for French readers. They have no idea how the European institutions work as I suppose in Germany or in anywhere in Europe. The difference is, as I was saying, as we don't have the Daily Mail or the Sun, is we don't have the very mainstream stories about how Europe is interfering with our day-to-day life. The stories about straight bananas or the power of vacuum cleaners or kettles. We do report on these on this in France, but it never makes the splash like it does here.
So the one final question I wanted to ask the panel before we open it up for questions is, looking at the polling data, the key group in the country in the referendum are going to be the under 25s. Larger proportions of under 25s that don't know, and under 25s are far less likely to vote than over 40s and over 50s. With the changing media habits of younger voters, do you think this presents a particular challenge in terms of trying to get information or facts to younger voters? We'll start with Anne and we'll work our way across.
I would say that young voters, although I don't necessarily want to discriminate against them, because I know lots of them who are quite committed to trying to understand things, but I would say they're probably the most liable to fall into this social media trap, whereby, since all their news comes from things that were recommended by other people, they're much more likely to live inside restricted information ghettos, which of course could go either way.
You guys, Katrin?
Well, I totally agree that it's more filtered basically by friends and social media, but I'm actually I'm a bit scared to be honest, because I feel like people must be so much more informed than the whole public must get so much more information, and besides the silly season stories when it comes to cucumbers or bananas or light bulbs, and at the same time it's quite complex. So I just don't know. It's for me, like always, I have to explain it in Germany all the time. Why is there a referendum after all? that's like a lot of people don't even understand. And people, I would say on the continent, it's probably the same in France. They have this very emotional connection basically to Europe, which is completely missing here. So I don't even know.
Young people in Vincent?
No, I wouldn't know either. I mean, we have the same, exactly the same problem in France. Young voters don't vote, so it's a major and it's a growing topic in any election. The fact that the older you are, the more you vote. It has a massive influence on all elections in France, like it has here.
Scotland was particularly interesting in terms of turnout amongst the young.
Yeah, yes, and I would be surprised if you see a repeat of that here. I think it will. The referendum result. I think it's pretty likely that it's going to be Remain, and I think that if it's not, and if Out somehow win, that will be to do with differential turnout. The fact that the Out campaign starts with 4 million UKIP votes in the bank. They're older. They're determined to vote. They're very motivated. But if the young get very, very engaged, that could change.
It doesn't help holding the referendum after you've moved to an electoral registration system that kicks 500,000 under-25s off the ballot. During Glastonbury, during the exams at university, where we've no idea whether the students are registered here or at home, nor are they. If you want to get young people off the ballot and not being able to vote, that's the way to do it.
It's almost as though the Prime Minister should have been better organised.
Anyway, let's open it up. So I think, do we have some roving mics? I saw this woman over here, her hand first, about halfway down on the right here with the... Let's take 3 questions. So.
Hi, being quite young myself, being only 18 and being allowed to vote this year, I know quite a lot of people like myself and people in my school particularly, studying politics especially, do really want to vote in terms of being in the EU referendum or not. And talking about how people in France and Germany, young people don't vote, do you think that's a problem within your own political system and ultimately your education system, that mean kids don't feel like they're properly educated enough to be able to vote? And do you think that giving young people the vote will almost represent a larger portion, of your demographic? And by doing this, do you not think that you will,
So young people don't feel informed enough to vote. How are we going to inform them? Okay, question down here.
Hi. A lot of the discussion seems to be very much about the economic situation and a lot of scaremongering. I personally think that if we stay in or leave, it's not going to really make much difference. There'll be losers and winners. I feel it's a political argument in the end about whether the UK wants to be free or not. And my question is, well, I've seen in the news, but I watch a lot of news, it seems to be an economic situation solely. Do you think possibly the political situation should actually be emphasised as well?
So the focus tends to be on economics. What about politics? Let's take one more. Woman down the front here, then we'll move further back.
Hi, Elif. There seems to be so much, like the person before me said, about the idea of talking economics and not talking about peace. Is peace not actually the most important thing to talk about? And maybe this is one of the ways that we can get young people more involved, because they seem to be more wanting a peaceful society to live in and their future. I want to link this to a second part to my note, really, is that with social media and digital literacy, for young people, politics is not on their agenda, on their news feeds. So therefore, how on earth are we going to get young people who are not politics students, like my friend at the back there, how on earth are we going to get young people involved? Does this mean that broadcasters actually have much more responsibility, especially the BBC, to talk politics from a young person's perspective?
So young people are not like my 15-year-old son who's obsessed with Bernie Sanders at the moment, but anyway. No, he has his mother who's American. So let's start with Iain. We'll work along any or all of those. To pick one or two.
But I mean, the implication. It's a very good question about peace. But the implication is that those of us who want to leave the European Union are not interested in peace and somehow in favour of war, which I can assure you is not the case. Okay, maybe a few UKIP voters want a war, but broadly, it is a dispute about self-government, and I mean the reason it focuses primarily on economics, it's a very simple reason, is that the Prime Minister's private pollster on all of this, Andrew Cooper, Lord Cooper, and the polling team that work with him have essentially come up with a formulation which is very positive arguments for the European Union don't really resonate with voters in focus groups or when they're polled. The best chance Remain have got is of terrifying people about the economic risks. So they took that decision months ago. They're not predicated their entire campaign on it. They're not about to change now. Conversely, the weird thing though is that Out, who are most interested in those ideas like self-government and see it more as a political and philosophical question rather than being purely economic, know that doesn't particularly resonate with voters. If you say to voters in a focus group, what about sovereignty? 1 in 10 will care. Lots won't know what it means. It just sounds very vague. So they have to try and somehow reassure people that that in are just terrifying them, that it's all a scare story. So that's why it focuses quite narrowly on economic questions rather than, for me, what's as interesting as the politics.
That sounds remarkably similar to Scotland in the last few weeks of the campaign, where the SNP was the self-government freedom, yes, and the stay in the union was an economic risk.
Well, the single biggest lesson from Scotland is that the reason that Salmond lost, other than lots of people feeling they didn't want their country torn apart, was that he was unable to answer very basic questions about the economics, about currency in particular. Currency, pensions, trade. So having observed that and seen that it was successful in Scotland, what the Prime Minister's doing is trying to do a European version of that. That's why you see them all the time say, look, sometimes they want it to be Switzerland, sometimes they want to be Norway, sometimes it's Sweden, it's Canada. What is it? To try and create the sense that Out don't have the answers.
Vincent?
I think it's, I'm afraid it's much too late to make the argument for peace in the UK debate because it's never been made before. I mean, what's striking for a European is that David Cameron, before the EU summit, never had a positive view of Europe, of the fact that it had, maybe helped bring peace to the continent since the Second World War. In France, and I suppose in Germany, it's the same. People don't like the EU as an institution, but many people have this vague idea in the back of the head that maybe this is why we didn't, invade each other for the past 100 years, which we'd never done before.
That was
the EU.
No, I'm sorry. That was NATO.
Why is it amazing?
That is not the NATO at all. I would say it's a political European Union.
And maybe it is. It's the Franco-German couple. Maybe it is.
We should have split them up. I saw quite clearly.
Maybe it is NATO, but I'm sure that in the mind of people, the EU counts. There are some very striking images of Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand holding hands in front of the graves.
And in creating the euro.
All this is in our mythology, even if it's not, the main reason.
Sure, but it is
in people's minds.
But this is one of the things I find striking about Europe and the discussion about the EU and how that is accepted as fact by people in France and by most people in Italy or Spain, whereas actually the reality is that the peace settlement post 1945 comes down to an incredible praiseworthy American commitment to Europe, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and a decades-long commitment to defeating the Soviet Union. I mean, of course, the EU in its current incarnation doesn't exist until 1992. Doesn't exist until Maastricht. I mean, it cannot be the case that the European Union is the reason that Germany has not invaded France. It may have contributed to trade and good feeling.
Actually, because it's not only, I would say it's not only, of course, like what you said, it's true, that's how it started after the war, but it's that everyday thing, that there are exchange programs, there's traveling, there's so many things, and actually it's very difficult to explain that to Brits, because we do feel very, very European and very, actually like very close. I feel very close to myself. But like we just see it in a totally different way. And actually peace is one of the biggest arguments when you ask someone in Germany or someone in Spain. And in Britain it doesn't play any role, and I think that is why it is so difficult now to explain to people why the European Union is a good thing, because there's no political argument, as you said. It's just it's a business deal, basically.
Yeah, so I would make 2 points. One is that I've always been amazed by how much of British politics is about economics. You know, you have these huge headlines about 1p in the something tax, or and actually the last election campaign was also won almost entirely on incredibly narrow economic arguments. That's how the Tories won. And so there is something about the nature of politics right now in Britain. Maybe that will change, which keeps the debate like that. I mean, I actually think that both Scottish nationalism and anti-EUism, I'm not sure what we call it, and Euroscepticism, are both kind of emotional reactions to this incredibly boring, economic-focused, nitpicking political debate that goes on here most of the time. People do want some kind of emotion in their politics, and so they find it. They find it in other ways. I mean, in terms of what the British public has not been told, I think there's another extraordinary positive story that Britain doesn't generally know, and Cameron has not told anybody, and nobody else did either, which is the success of British arguments inside Europe about the nature of Europe. You know, the fact that there is a single market, that there is competition policy, which is an antitrust policy, which makes trade easier. This was a British argument. It's been the British position. You know, Britain has shaped the nature of the EU in a really profound and important way, and goes on doing that. And that isn't understood is amazing to me. And other Europeans know it to the extent that there's a lot of resentment of it. You know, the French didn't like the single market, because they want protectionism and so on. You know, and they feel that there's been this British influence in Europe, which has changed the nature of it. Extraordinarily, and the British themselves don't know that, and they keep talking about sovereignty without understanding that by being in the EU, they've had an enormous amount of influence, that they have more power, they're able to change things and influence how the EU works, and yet that's never registered at all, and still doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. The person who you could say is maybe the father of the single market is a guy called Arthur Cofield, which no one's ever heard of. Thatcher's trade secretary, who was then sent to Brussels, and then as she saw it, went native. And he did two things in the 1980s. He was the driving force behind Big Bang and the revolution in the city at a crucial meeting, and he was single market stuff. But he just lost to history, and the Brits tell each other a slightly sort of garbled version of history. The observation I would make, though, is that one of the things I find most off-putting about UKIP, as someone who's a moderate who wants a different kind of relationship with the European Union, is the way in which it is presumed that you're either British or European. Lots of us who want that different relationship are European. Absolutely love France, Germany, Spain, Italy, love travelling there, spending time there. I don't think it is being proposed by anyone, short of a tiny minority of UKIP supporters, to end that. But surely we can structure something which allows us to trade and cooperate, which is not this in my view, this failed machine which has gifted us the euro and a migration crisis.
But you're not in the euro, and you're not part of the migration
I'll resist the
crisis, so
temptation
you're out
to
of
get
it.
involved in the debate. I
Okay.
wanted to address the young... I wanted to address the question about the young voters. All across democracies, advanced democracies, it's a real challenge of getting young people to vote. What we know is that voting is a habit. So if you get people to vote in their first election, the probability they vote in their second election is above 75%. So it's about getting young voters to vote in their first election. And this is why the voting age to 16 I find quite interesting, because what we know from Austria and what we know from Scotland is when they lowered the voting age to 16, people were taught in school how to vote. And they were taken all together and taught in school. They were registered. The school registered them, put their names on the electoral register, showed them how to vote. So once you're out of school and your friends aren't voting and you're not voting, it's a bit of a mystery. It's mystifying. How do I register? Where do I go? What is the polling station? And most young people are too embarrassed to actually admit they don't know this stuff. So I would be in favour of lowering the age. Why they didn't lower the age to 16 for this referendum, I do not know. And I wanted to ask Iain about that for Scotland. What's your view about it was lowered to 16 for the Scottish referendum?
In Scotland, it had an extraordinary impact. It gave the Yes campaign, the Independence campaign, incredible energy. And why did they? I mean, you're asking me to try and explain the Prime Minister's logic.
Now, would you have been in favour of it Would you have been in favour of it, having experienced it in Scotland? Would you have been in favour of it for the referendum?
Personally opposed to it for different reasons, but I can't answer your question because I don't know why the Prime Minister didn't do it.
Okay.
It doesn't make any sense, but lots of how the government has conducted the European debate in the last year doesn't make any sense.
All right. We've got time for one final round of questions. So up at the back there, I see a gentleman there with his hat on there.
Much of the debate has been focused around the power of the media and the impotence, if you like, if you believe some of the representatives of the press. What hasn't been discussed is the power of the public. And this is particularly important because the last time we had a referendum on this issue was 41 years ago. And nothing has happened in between, although so much has happened in the transformation of the EEC into the EU. And nobody has focused on why the public doesn't have a voice in this issue over a period of time. And this is something which is really at the heart of this whole issue.
Public hasn't had a voice for 40 plus years. Okay. Looking for a woman.
I think so.
This is the LSE after all.
I thought it was quite interesting the lack of, in the debate, I thought it was quite interesting the lack of discussion on the actual role of the EU institutions. I was thinking about this as we were talking about if there was a question on the House of Lords, and people were talking about the question of whether the House of Lords whether we should keep that or whether we should reform it. It's the equivalent of, without really explaining it, sort of laughing at people who are saying that the House of Lords is sort of laughing at people who are saying it's a hereditary thing without really engaging and explaining how it works.
So why not more coverage of the European institutions? And we have down the front here has been waiting patiently.
Hi, I was just interested in the idea that these fact-checking websites, which are springing up, seem to be springing up more during the Brexit.
We have fact-checking websites checking the fact-checking websites now.
I suppose my question is that, does the introduction of fact-checking websites with a specific agenda dilute the more independent sites like Full Fact?
Yes.
Yeah, very good one. I would address that one to Anne. We'll keep that to the end. Power of the public. Does it feel like from France or Germany that the British public is not powerful? You've had referendums in France. You don't have referendums in Germany.
Well, I suppose the question would be on how you vote. I mean, you can't say that the European question hasn't been in the political debate these past 20 years, although there hasn't been a referendum. It's been a major political topic, much more than in France, for instance. But then there's the question of how often do you hold referendums, and that's a more general question, I guess.
I don't really understand. There are European elections every once in a while. The public does have a vote, basically. And I just think like the referendum a referendum about the European Union is quite tricky, as we can see now, because it's a very complex system, organization. It has a lot of things. I mean, like from a German perspective, I don't even understand why there is a referendum, really. And I kind of think like all of a sudden everyone is like wanting more, a voice, basically. And then no one is voting at the European elections, and no one is actually asking the government to send good MEPs to Brussels either, to kind of have a voice and to shape the EU.
We had a referendum last week in the Netherlands on whether the UK-Ukraine Association Agreement should be ratified.
Completely farcical.
Yeah.
Utterly farcical.
So, Anne, fact-checking websites,
I just
fact-checking
want to
websites.
say one word about, the problem with referendums, the question is also, why don't we get to have more referendums in Europe? Well, why don't we have more referendums about the NHS? Or why don't we have more referendums about, the monarchy? Or why don't we, the point about representative government is that, you vote for a party and then you vote for politicians who take the decisions. And the trouble is that when you start breaking it down, you can create a situation where you have a total deadlock on government. You have that California is the famous example where people keep voting for tax cutting, but they won't vote for, and then they're surprised when they can't afford to have schools, and so there's a big problem with the referendum in general. That's my opposition to this referendum is the same as I would have to any referendum, which is that it takes an issue out of context. People vote about it for emotional reasons that have nothing to do with the issue itself. When David Cameron, when the thing about his father and inheriting the money from the offshore fund happened, I thought, oh God, now the EU referendum will be thrown by this. You have these incidental issues that can throw a referendum that have nothing to do with the real issue.
But I think this, I agree with what Anne just said, but with this referendum, I think the big difference is that the question is really, this time, very simple, very straightforward. People can understand it.
You could have a simple and straightforward question about NHS reform too, so why don't we have that?
That would be more difficult.
No.
The referendum we had in France in 2005 was about an obscure treaty, 1,000 pages that nobody had ever read, so it was much more trickier. At least this question is simple.
Yeah, it comes to Iain and said, but as a political scientist of democracies, my general rule of thumb on this is, I think referendums are worthwhile if it's an issue that cuts across party lines. It's a major constitutional question. That's a simple major constitutional question, and it has multi-generational consequences. You don't have referendums. If you have referendums on policy issues that can change from one day to the next, then you end up like the mess you have in California, as Anne outlined. But I think it's appropriate to have a referendum that has multi-generational consequences, that's a major constitutional question and cuts across party lines. I can see that's why you have normally referendums to ratify constitutions. You have referendums to decide whether you want to change the electoral system. You have referendums on whether you want to join the euro. You have referendums whether you want to join the EU or leave the EU. And I can even see a case for a referendum on Trident on that criteria. But anyway, we'll move over to Iain.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The other reason I would usually be opposed to referendums, but the other reason I think this has to be done is it just has to be settled, because the British are becoming boring. The British have got to decide, are they actually properly in and engage in the institutions? And I've had to spend a lot more time in Brussels recently around the Commission, because I write more about finance now, and it is not covered quite as it should be. There are a few brilliant journalists who do it, but it's not a priority for the way the editors would spend their money. They've got depleted resources. Should they establish a 3 or 4 person team to cover the Commission? Yes, of course they should, but the economic reality is that they're not going to. Just one point about the facts side of things. I think the problem is that whenever I hear on shows like Question Time, we just want the facts. Please just give us the facts. The problem is that the facts are generally, other than basic economic facts, are disputed. They're contested. A lot of them are facts about the future, about how you think global politics and economics will develop in the next 15 to 20 years. It's not possible to answer that question. It's not even possible to argue with any certainty about what would happen, particularly to the City of London. So I think facts are contested, and very often the people who are checking the facts on one side have stated their support for one side of the argument and tend to check the facts of their opponents, but not themselves.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and it remains for me to thank you for coming and to thank the panel.